Welcome to the Stoke It Up podcast. What's going on? I'm here with Kenneth Priest, and we are going to talk again about, well, actually, we're going to start a solo conversation here on church revitalization. Kenneth, how you doing, man?
Man, doing great. It's good to see you. Glad to connect.
Yeah, we're getting ahead on some podcasting, and we got a plan for the future. One of the things we're going to do in the future is we're going to find some church pastors and or leaders and have them tell their church stories. And we're really looking for some people that maybe wouldn't even get an invite on a podcast.
That's right.
I think that would be dynamite to find some ordinary churches with some ordinary pastors and say, tell us the story of what God is doing through your church. I think one of the things that doesn't get stated out well is that small churches can have great commission impact. Now, I say that sounds so trendy and trite. But what I mean by that is there is a certain motivation that you can have for the Great Commission that you don't have to be a big church and you don't have to make the same kind of big splashy impact to motivate and mobilize people in small churches.
That's right. And you can still have a splash of impact. It may be on a smaller scale, but it might still be on a big scale. It's just nobody knows how to register that scale because it's coming out of the small church instead of the large church that has a marketing strategy of how they're going to tell their story.
Yeah, that's awesome. One of the great stories I love to tell, but as we transition toward, I got some questions for you about revitalization.
Yeah, man.
We did a free car wash at Calvary Ruidoso, and we were positioned perfectly for it. We were in a parking lot with a college, a small junior college, and an Albertsons, and there were some other small businesses. It was a hub of travel. You pull up to go to Albertsons, you see the church. So we
That's
would
good.
set up on the side and we would do a free car wash. People would try to give us money. We'd be like, no, we're not taking your money. We're just showing you God's love in a practical way. I remember Cicely Powell flagged me over and said, hey, come talk to this guy. I talked to him through the driver's side window, shared the gospel with Andrew, and I'll never forget looking at him across the seat there, and I asked him if he was ready. I was going to lead him to the Lord right then. And he wasn't ready. He had the deer in the headlights look. Not that he didn't understand, but that it was as if God had grasped him and he was trying to contemplate that. So it was obvious that he wasn't ready. And I said, look, man, when you're ready, you hit me up.
That's right.
Well, 2 months later during COVID, he hits me up on Facebook Messenger in a video call. And
Mm.
I looked at him and I said, dude, what's up? I didn't expect to hear from him. He said, I'm ready.
And you
And you
knew
ne-
what that was.
you never know. You never
You
know
don't.
how some kind of small splash will have an impact. Okay, let's talk about revitalization because those are the kind of things I think you can do to revitalize your church. Kenneth, first of
Absolutely.
all, tell us what church revitalization is. And then the second question will be, what do you see as the current state of revitalization after 20 years of watching it go down? So what is
Yeah.
it and where is it?
Yeah, so that it's a great lead-off question, Adam, because a lot of people get confused about what revitalization actually is. And I always try to be clear, revitalization is not about assembling a crowd, right? There are plenty of I'm going to try to avoid naming names, but there are plenty of motivational speakers who are portraying themselves as pastors that can go out and draw a crowd. And people on the outside look at it and say, look, that guy's revitalized this church because he knows how to draw a crowd. Drawing a crowd is not revitalization. Drawing a crowd is drawing a crowd. Revitalization has to do with the spiritual undercurrent that's taking place in the life of a church so that the way I describe it for most pastors is it's in management. There's this theory that's called the Mack truck theory. Anybody could walk out the door and get hit by a Mack truck. And the question in management is, are you prepared that if you were the guy that got hit by a Mack truck, could your position continue to exist, not just to get by, but to thrive? And as a manager, you're supposed to build an organization around that. Well, a pastor's supposed to build an organization around that model. If you were not the pastor of this church today, could this church continue to thrive, not survive, but thrive without you being there? If it hinges on you, it's personality driven. That's drawing a crowd. So have you created the structure, the culture, so that whether you're there or not, this church can not only exist, but can continue to grow and impact the community? We're, as pastors, we're supposed to work ourselves out of a job. That doesn't mean we're always looking to leave the church we're in. What that means is we're creating a culture so that we could leave and the church could continue to grow and thrive and be. So revitalization is the idea of systems and structures that are in place for the advancement of kingdom growth in the midst of whatever transition is happening in the life of the church, the community, individual life of the pastor, the spiritual leaders of the church.
All right. That was a mouthful. What is the current state? Revitalization has been around, I don't know, 20 years, 15 to
Well,
20 years as a hot topic.
yeah, so I'll cover it. Of course, I come from a Baptist background, and so a lot of my perspective is from Baptist. But you can kind of take these numbers, and I mean, Southern Baptists are kind of this largest Protestant denomination, but you can kind of take these and kind of put it across the denominations, and of course, everything is about the type of church. So you're talking about evangelical churches. So revitalization. We go back and, Ken Hemphill in Southern Baptist Life wrote initially about the need for revitalization in a book he wrote called Revitalizing the Sunday Morning Dinosaur. It was about Sunday schools, small groups, and the fact that baptisms had been on decline for over a decade. And this is in 1998, I guess, is when that book released. And so he looked since 1985 in Southern Baptist Life, baptisms have been on decline. Well, he writes that book and he's trying to get people talking again about engaging in Sunday school small group ministry and having an impact again in people's lives with evangelism and disciple making. And it doesn't really take off like you think that it would. If there's a problem with baptism, then we need to do something. But nobody really pays attention to that. It's not until 2005 when Ed Stetzer starts talking about it that it really begins to take hold. And then in our denomination around 2007, 2008 is when it really launches and says, we've got to do something. Now, there's some other denominations that were talking about it a few years before, but it really doesn't become this public conversation until around those years, and we start seeing more publishing done on this, more research done on this, more people engaging. And so it's been the past 20 years that this has been kind of in this zone of hot topic. And the reality is, as you study the statistics, it's not having the conversation is not doing any good. It's the old idea. We sit around the campfire talking about stuff all the time, but nobody's actually doing anything about it, right?
Yeah.
And so we have guys researching, we have guys writing, we have guys talking, but most of the experts in church revitalization are guys that go out and know how to draw a crowd. The question I always ask is, so I look at a guy that's up on a platform speaking. I look at these guys that are writing books, and you and I both have written books, and I look at this stuff and I go, it's not about what happened while they were at that church that they're writing about. It's not about what has happened at the churches they've consulted with or engaged in. It's what happened when they're done. When they walk away, is that church continuing to grow? And a lot of times it's not. The ones that are out there speaking are speaking out of philosophical, what should work And there's several experts that people want to turn to and get their opinion on church revitalization. They don't know anything about revitalization. It's all theory based. It's theoretical revitalization. This should occur according to biblical principles. And absolutely right. This should occur. However, biblical principles have to get confronted with contextualized real life praxis, right? And so when we look at the practicum of living out a church, there are things that confront in the church, sin in the church, difficult personalities that you're dealing with that cause revitalization not to occur. And so pastors are confronted with how to deal with conflict and these things. So, and you hate to say the Bible's irrelevant, the Bible is very relevant for dealing with those things. But just to say, if you apply these biblical principles, your church is going to turn around is not a true statement. You have to apply these biblical principles and you have to be receiving a biblical response from the community that you're applying it in order for revitalization to occur. So in reality, we're not having a lot of great success in revitalization. I've written a couple of articles over the past year dealing with kind of what's the status of the church today. And you look at overall, and still only about less than 20% of churches are growing, and about 40% are in decline. And so that middle 40% are plateaued. Well, 80% of churches were declining 20 years ago, and 80% of churches are still declining today. And so we're doing a lot of talking, Alan, but we're not really accomplishing revitalization. Are there outliers? Absolutely. We can find little church here and there. You know, I got a guy down in Houston that several years ago, he went in and just did a bang up job in an old established Anglo church, converted to be multicultural, went from 60 to 400, has created the systems and structures for ongoing growth, engaging in the community. He and his wife, being young newlyweds, they moved into this gang-ridden community as as a young Anglo couple because they knew being close to the church is what's going to bring a more pastoral impact, so that he could be the pastor in this community. Things like that. So we can find the outliers where we see genuine revitalization taking place. But there's not story after story after story after story. Of my work of the past, at least for the past 20 years, I've been engaged in revitalization work since actually you were up at Dial. That was a revitalization before we were calling it that. It's a turnaround situation. So ever since 96, 97, when you and I first got together and started working on things together, that's how long, things have been. And right now, looking at where we are today, less than 25% of churches will engage in church revitalization. So 75% of those 80% of churches that need to revitalize still won't revitalize. And that kind of, led to me asking you that question of, what holds a church back from church revitalization? So, talk on that, man. What do you think? What is holding churches back from wanting to be revitalized?
Okay, that's great. So when I became Calvary Chapel, which I kind of consider myself, I tell people I'm still a separatist. Calvary Chapels are separatist people. But I still have some Baptist things attached, of course, and I'm thankful for that. But one of the things I realized in Calvary Chapels, there is this view or this tone that you don't get too hyped up about church growth. That was a response from Chuck Smith to say, everybody tone it down. Chuck started going to these. Well, Calvary Costa Mesa blew up. He started growing, and they want his denomination. He was a Foursquare guy. They wanted to give him all these awards, and he finally just stopped and said, "Don't give me anything else." He just became disillusioned with the whole thing, and I think there's a healthy part of that, where I used to go to Baptist things and the convention sometimes, I'd be wore out because you get all these success stories and then you're at this church that needs revitalization and you can't get the inside of that church. It just would weigh on you. And I know many pastors, regardless of your denomination, that's kind of where you can be. So it was a healthy thing for me to let go of some of my tenacity toward church growth. Now, the other side to that is you got to pay attention to it. And many Calvary pastors have realized, yeah, we're still going to keep a low key. We are informal. We're not going to get all hyped up with just growth programs to try to do this. We're going to be steady. We're going to teach the word. We're going to pray. But there has been this move, Kenneth, in Calvary churches to know, okay, we're going to still be who we are, but we do need to lean in to things and ask questions about the Great Commission, if I could throw the idea of church growth as the Great Commission. I remember when Greg Laurie one time at Calvary Costa Mesa, before the Calvary Global Network and CCA split, it was packed. And Greg Laurie came in there, and I mean, he pistol whipped those pastors. He basically said, if you haven't won one person to Jesus this year, you ought to be ashamed. It was rough.
Yeah.
I thought, wow, Greg just went off on him. Well, he's an evangelist. He's going to do stuff like that. So what holds a church back from engaging in revitalization? All of that little setup story to say, sometimes there can be this, well, we're okay. We just teach the word. We'll just keep doing what we do. We don't have to get urgent about it. That can be, I think that tone is a killer. And it's not just a killer to the fact that you're not revitalizing. If I hear a pastor say that, I go, wow, so it makes me wonder if that person would be okay with a dead church.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
You're okay with doing nothing. Revival doesn't mean anything. I don't know. I may be adding into it, but I hear those things and I go, no, there comes a time when you gotta do something to shake it up, man. You can't just sit there and go, well, we're just going to teach the word. And if God wants to give it, he'll give it. If he doesn't, he doesn't. We already know that. Okay. That's an excuse to be lazy.
Yeah, exactly.
Now,
Yeah,
dude,
so
I sound like you saying something like that.
you do. You do. So, this is what led me. So in my consulting work, I had longhand, I would meet with a pastor that wants to talk about his church needs to be revitalized. And I asked the question, how long do you think your church has before it dies? Well, a plateaued church, there's a long life expectancy there. And even a small, you think about, like we talk about Dial a lot, the little church up in the field. There was a long life expectancy there. I mean, it's kind of one of those things that it's a little family chapel and there's all these people that are around, not a huge crowd, but there's a crowd. They own their building. They everything. So you got to pay for insurance. You got to pay for electricity. You got to pay for water. But what else is there to pay for? Pay for the pastor to come preach on Sunday, and he's got a little parsonage. You got all these things that it would take forever for a church like that to truly close its doors. And so all these rural churches kind of exist with that. They don't have the issues that you have in the city with church issues that you're having to come up with to take care of your property. And the same way you don't have to go get all these permits when you want to go fix something on your camp. There's just a lot of freedom when you're out in those rural contexts.
Yeah.
So I developed a church life expectancy calculator several years ago because I would come in and I would do all this longhand work. I'd be, oh man, give me all this data and let me do it. And so I'd sit around and it would take me, 20, 30, depending on how good their data was, 20 or 30 hours for me to run the numbers and figure out how long's the church got in this community context. Well, I created a calculator that now a pastor can sit down in a matter of minutes. He just types in all the data and boom, it's going to output the data for you that says, unless something cataclysmic happens. The reality is this church has 5 years, 8 years, 20 years before it's going to die if it continues on the current path that it's on. And so I did that to make life easier for me as a consultant, But, I've had some success with other guys taking and using it. And it gives me a lot of feedback when somebody calls me. I can say, hey, plug your numbers into this, call me back, tell me what it says, and then we can have an honest conversation. And so the reality is churches, in my opinion, churches don't engage in revitalization because, like you're saying, they don't think they need it. Hey, we're okay. If I'm in a
Yeah.
plateaued church, man, I mean, revitalization, when my church could last for 30 more years, I mean, I'm going to be dead and gone by then. I mean, we're good. We can just keep doing what we're doing, and we'll keep trying and tweaking and seeing what we can do, and maybe something will work and maybe something won't work, and it's no big deal, right? And the reality is, the whole time we have this attitude, there's people outside the church that are dying and going to hell. And that is supposed to be what motivates the pastor to want to engage his community with the good news of Jesus Christ. And to say, wait a second, this is unacceptable. We should, even if the church is complacent, we shouldn't be complacent. And we need to be addressing that. And so it kind of leads to the next point that I would ask is, what's the importance of a worship service in church revitalization? So, from your perspective, how important is worship for the church in church revitalization?
It's crucial. I think it's probably the number one thing. I would say that relationships are probably the first thing, but let's assume you've got good, healthy relationships going, but you need to create a situation where when people come, they leave going, I'm glad I was there. I was fed, I'm motivated. It was an experience that I liked. I think the worship service is crucial. If you don't have, I say it like this, good music, doesn't have to be excellent music, but it can't be bad. It just can't be bad music. You need good music. You need good preaching. It's better if you can have good preaching that kind of pursues excellence. Only God can produce excellent preaching, but it's good preaching that the preaching is growing, it's relevant, it's actually using the word of God. I think that's very important. I think if you're going to, and the preacher's got to be excited about preaching. I think
Yeah.
many preachers are just kind of ho-hum with preaching, and they need to get excited about preaching. The next would be kids. You need on Sunday morning, your kids need to have an experience with that. I talked with Nadia Jennett over the weekend. She and
Yeah.
Steve came to the house, and I was picking her brain about kids ministry. She's at Fielder Church in Arlington, everybody, for our listeners. And she's the preschool leader there. And no, not the preschool leader. She is the kids leader at the Grand
Yeah.
Prairie campus. So I got on ChatGPT and I had it create for me a kids morning design. And that design is not based on just a lesson. You got to have
Yeah.
more than just a lesson. So anyway, it's something that has to be thought through. And then the next thing would be hospitality. I think in this culture, you've got to have hospitality. You need to come in, you need to have some coffee, you need to have some cookies. That represents Acts 2:42 fellowship. I know it's in a very light way, so it's not the only fellowship, but without it, it just is, it needs to be intentional.
Yeah.
So I've said worship as worship music, preaching, kids, and hospitality. To me, those four cylinders got to be hitting.
Yeah. The way I usually talk about it, Alan, with a church and with a pastor, I just tell them, say, look, and try to relate to pastors and give them their three P's. You got to have a place for people to park. Your campus, you're not going to get people to come if you don't have a place for them to park, right? And so access to your building, whatever that looks like. If you're a downtown church, people can park anywhere on the streets and walk. That's great. If you're out in the country, then you got to have parking marked off. People understand where they can pull into your parking lot and park and come. So parking, preaching, and preschool. I hit those. I hit those three,
That's good.
and then I
That's
dive
really
into
good.
those just like you just did, and said, look, Without the three P's, you're not going to succeed. And what we're talking about here, a lot of people say, sounds like y'all talking about church growth. This isn't really about church growth. This is what revitalization is. It's about how to reach people. And you can't reach people any other way. Because again, I mentioned a moment ago, there's plenty of motivational speakers that are portraying themselves as pastors out there. And so people want to go hear a good communicator. And so if you're a pastor, you need to be working on your communication skills. That should be a skill that you're honing and developing. What is it? Haddon Robinson's big volume of the craft of preaching. Isn't
Yeah.
that what it was called?
Yep. The craft of preaching.
You got to get your preaching done right, correctly, honoring God's word, but also in a way that's engaging the context of this community and making sure you know how to reach these people. I think that's real good. Well, let's tie that in because you brought this fellowship side, and I really tie that into the next element. You talked about hospitality, but you also talked about relational, is the importance of small groups. And you and I, we first started, when you and I first started doing all of this work on writing and podcast and thinking through these things and having these engagement conversations. It stemmed out of your dissertation, expositional preaching and the sermon-based small group. And, I built my dissertation off of yours because in yours, I was reading your dissertation and you said, most churches don't have the skill set. Most pastors don't have the team or the skill set to do sermon-based small groups as a year-round model. When you're a single staff church, but you could do it for special topics, for special seasons in a church's life. And I kind of thought, church revitalization is a season in a church's life. And so that's what built mine, the sermon-based small group and church revitalization methodology that I created. And so using that idea, it's a season, and so we can develop this tool. So what's the importance of small groups in church revitalization?
I would say they provide synergy, motivation, unity, and community. Um, I I think that I like what you did. I was thinking about that when we take a 6 to 8 week period, let's say in the fall and in the spring, and we say to the church, no matter what size of the church, and we say, look, for 6 to 8 weeks, we want every person in this church, we want you to get in a small group. Now, we know we're not going to get everybody, but our standard's going to be we expect community. Well, we say, we want you in a group, just 6 to 8 weeks. That's all we want. We don't want more. We're not asking, we're just saying, get in this group. That will help a church. I can't imagine. You get in that church and you start and the topic could be, hey, what do you like about our church? What do you like? Where do you need to grow? It can be just all questions, all discussion and prayer and
Yeah.
fellowship. That alone would be so beneficial. It would be so outside the box of what we normally do. Now, for those of you listening, you're going, what are those sermon-based small groups? Those are the ones where whatever the preacher brings up in the text on Sunday, we reiterate and reinforce through questions related to the text and then an additional Bible teaching in a small group. In this context for revitalization, it would involve what does it look like for us personally to be revitalized so that our church can be revitalized? Okay, now that I get that out, what are you sitting there thinking about small groups, Kenneth? What impact have you seen? Because you've got practical experience at this with, I used to tell people, man, Kenneth's one of the few guys that's actually seen this work.
Yeah, and we have, and the reality is, when we think about, to me, I step back and I look at, and you and I have this conversation all the time. Sunday school is supposed to function like a small group. The problem is most churches, they allow Sunday school to be hijacked, and they don't run it and function it like its original purpose was. If you go back to the purpose of Sunday school, it's supposed to be the small group model. But when you're using Sunday school or small groups, they are a disciple-making strategy. And so the success in using sermon-based small groups specifically, but using your small group ministry to engage in revitalization, is you're discipling people in the Word of God and in the community of faith, which you mentioned pre this, and then you also embed it in this conversation of small groups, that it's all about developing that community context that you want to develop. The reality is you begin to ask the question in church revitalization is, what do we want our people to look like? And what do we want them to engage in? And you brought up this idea of fellowship earlier. And you brought it out of Acts 2:42 and following. And the reality is, a lot of people stop on the coffee and donuts side of fellowship. If you actually study that Greek word, koinonia, that's in there, and see how Paul used it in other contexts, like over in Colossians, koinonia, fellowship, genuine fellowship leads to missional engagement. And so it's not just about having a meal together, engaging in the food side of it, but it is this community of faith that says, not only do we have our meals together, but we engage in mission together. And so we're missional in our community. We're actually trying to reach our community for Christ. And this is one of the ways that we do that, is we build a community of fellowship. And then this small community is engaging in missions. And so it's coming back and looking, saying the whole point of what we're doing in our Sunday school small groups, or what we're supposed to be doing, is making disciples. And making disciples is making someone, go back to the Great Commission, who can evangelize and teach people about Jesus so that they're reproducing themselves. And so that means our sermon-based small groups are supposed to be reproducible methods of engaging the community. And it creates a context. And that kind of leads me to my next question is, contextually, how does revitalization taking place, or how should it take place in a community? So how do you engage your community context in revitalization? Because that's a lot different. A lot of churches, their approach is, and I'm not trying to disparage any denomination, but you go back, if you've ever read George Hunter III's The Celtic Way of Evangelism, he talks about St. Patrick, and he talks about the Catholic model. What Patrick did was go against the Catholic model of evangelism for the day. Back in that late 4th, early 5th century, their model was to go build a church. You clean people up before you ever bring them to church. And Patrick went into Ireland, and he was like, no, man, we're going to go find people of peace. We're going to reach them for Christ, and then worry about cleaning them up and what they look like later. And it was a radical shift in how to do missions during his day. And it's that radical shift that we need. We got to think about, instead of saying, I need people to look like my church. And you've got firsthand experience with this. You've been in 2 churches that I know of that did not like the type of people you were reaching. They wanted those people to clean themselves up before they came to church. And you're out there reaching these guys and saying, man, look, come to Jesus, come to our church. We're going to deal with cleaning you up as you are a part of our family of faith. We're not going to expect you to get your life squared away before you start coming here. And it caused conflict for you as a pastor. And that's the part of if the church is going to truly engage in revitalization in your community context, you've got to step back and ask that question. What do we expect to happen in this church if we're actually engaging this community?
Yeah, that. I'm sitting here now that we're down into these questions and we're at the end of the podcast, and I'm going, man, we've got a whole nother topic going, because the questions that I have in my mind are, what's the relationship of the heart of the pastor when the people don't want to revitalize? Should you move forward on that? And I'm sitting there thinking the people have to be involved. If the people don't want to revitalize, I would almost say don't do it. And then you told me this one time, and I've quoted you on it. You've said, if, be willing to be fired if you're going to revitalize your church.
That's right.
And that can look a bunch of different ways depending on the denomination you're in. You know, that can't really happen in a Calvary Chapel church, although there is drama in Calvary's. At sometimes the way it's set up, it's not a congregationally governed church, so it's much more difficult to run the pastor off in a Calvary fellowship. However, in a Baptist fellowship, even in that system, it's not supposed to happen. And this is where it can get dicey is no matter what your polity, if enough people come up against it, they can really cause some havoc. The question that could be a whole different conversation.
Absolutely.
And we're out of time. We've got
Yeah,
to
we
run.
are. I told you, man, this was going to be a lot of information in a little
Yeah,
bit of
it's
time.
well, we will do this again. Revitalization is important. I can tell you that because to be honest, even the best of churches needs to ask questions about its own health in life.
That's right.
We're talking about church health and not just church growth.
That's right.
The growth will come from the health. The growth are markers that we can look at to identify that we do need revitalization, but there's not this desire to get any church or any Christian to this legalistic growth point where you can count the numbers and go, oh, look at what we did. We're really not trying to talk about that as much as it's possible to be vibrant and to be a healthy church. I would say if you're a small church, I try to shoot for one baptism a month. If I'm an
Yeah.
average church, to me, that's the average. And I'm not trying to say that's up or down. That's not a legalistic number, but that's kind of what I goal to so that we can at least be going, okay, if we don't, what do we need to do? How can we engage the community context? How do we measure? In other words, how do we measure church revitalization? I can't keep going. We must stop, Kenneth.
That's right. Our time is up, but you're on the right path because it all results in reaching the lost.
Let's put a pin in it. We'll pick this up at another time. And next week, we're going to start a series on stories from churches. And so we look forward to seeing you guys next week. Thank you for tuning in to the Stoke It Up podcast with a couple of guys like Kenneth Priest and Alan Stoddard. We greatly appreciate you, and we will see you next week.
Have a great week.
I need to make 1,000 notes.